Mega Man, and Banjo and Kazooie, there are some additions to the Smash roster that have had very little fanfare, to extreme hatred in the reaction to the reveal of them being included in the roster. We all know who these characters are, and in today's video, we're going to highlight every one of them. Now, I know these are scary times during a worldwide crisis. We don't need to be focusing on the negatives, but think of it more as a parody, and we're making fun of these characters for laughs, rather than hating and being negative. That, and I'm genuinely curious of who you guys think are the most hated characters in the franchise. So, since Smash 64 has a rather small roster of characters, and has a history of being merely an experiment, I will exclude it from being looked at in this video. However, we will talk about Melee's roster for a bit, because this was the roster where clones became a thing. Ha, yes, clones. Those characters that play just like another roster member and were added to fill a spot on the roster and make it look all the more bigger and more impressive. We had such fan favorites as Dr. Mario, Young Link, and Pichu, who were nearly carbon copies of their OG counterparts. Falco was also a hell of a lot like Fox, but he became more and more of a semi-clone as the games went on. And he has his fair share of fans, so his inclusion did serve a purpose. Same goes for Roy, who was a worse Marth, but both were added to include Fire Emblem in the roster, and that ended up expanding the series to the West, which means both characters were a roaring success. Then last of all, and perhaps the most infuriating of all, is Ganondorf. Not so much as inclusion, because being the big bad of the most successful Zelda game ever warrants an inclusion anytime. But it's more the fact that they made him a slow, but more powerful semi-clone of Captain Falcon. He's a spell-casting warlock in Zelda, but fuck all that, let's make him a punchy, kicky heavy. And to this day, he still plays this way. I really have no idea why he was never truly improved on as the games evolved, but moving on. As far as Brawl is concerned, I don't recall any character confirmations that the fandom full-on hated. Sure, Meta Knight became universally disliked for his top-tier brokenness, but that was once he was playable. When he was shown off in Brawl's reveal trailer, he was just another inclusion to the roster that most were happy to okay with. Rob may have had a lot of what-the-fuck reactions, but I don't remember mass vitriol for his inclusion. It was more like when people raised eyebrows for Ice Climbers and Mr. Game & Watch before him. Hey, that's an obscure choice, but this moveset's wacky and fun, so we're alright with it in the end type. Oh, yeah, and Toon Link was a clone replacement for Young Link, since Wind Waker was the previous generation's Zelda title. But again, I think there was more apathy there than hate. And now we move on to Smash 4, and for all the great inclusions we had, and there were a few that were fantastic, we had a handful that were less than desired, shall we say. The first reveal that I remember being lukewarm was when Palutena was revealed to close out Nintendo's E3 Direct in 2014. That's right, Palutena's Smash reveal was Nintendo's grand finale for that year. They chose to unveil Pac-Man behind closed doors and update the site with him and his trailer much later on. I mean, it wasn't even broadcasted. Which most people were even iffy on Pac-Man's inclusion at the time, if I'm going to be honest about it. But since he was a third-party character, it would have been much more accepted. Instead, we got what the fandom has dubbed Sakurai Bias. What is this, you may ask? Well, let's define it, shall we? So, in Brawl, we had the inclusions of two more Kirby characters, Meta Knight and King Dedede. Now, these are characters that have pretty solid roles within the Kirby series as both villains and unlikely allies. But since they are from Kirby, a Sakurai-created series, it means they were added due to Sakurai wanting to add characters from other series he has had involvement with. Whether that's fair or not, some of the fan base sees it this way. Case in point, Palutena. Since Sakurai had revived the Kid Icarus series from an over 20-year period of being dead, and making both Pit and Palutena compelling characters in the revival game Kid Icarus Uprising, this was seen as a Sakurai Bias inclusion. But more on that later, my friends. Now, let's talk about characters who some people soured on because of some major trolling involved in their reveals. So, Chrom was a big-time fan favorite from Fire Emblem Awakening. And when they did the reveal of Lucina getting in and then being saved by Robin, which is the name they gave the protagonist you control in Awakening, which also confirmed that they were in the game as well, and then having Chrom say, "I suppose I'll get my chance another day." Yeah, it was a big middle finger to all of his fans and was basically saying, well, we picked the chick this time instead. I remember Chrom being a much more requested character than either of the two Awakening reps they chose. But this reaction pales in comparison to other characters we will soon address. Now we go to a character who had just as much of a trolley reveal, and that character is also an example of a shill character, so a double negative in the Smash community. And that character is none other than Greninja. Before being revealed, they kept him in the shadows and had him charge an attack which I swear was intentionally made to tease him as Mewtwo instead. Then Greninja was shown off to an overwhelming meh reaction, and people going, why did they pretend he was Mewtwo? And since Pokemon X and Y had just launched about 6 months before this reveal, it was obvious Nintendo was betting on him being a popular starter, and using that assumption, they threw him into Smash to maybe spark some interest back into X and Y. But hey, at least Pokemon is seen as the second biggest franchise in Smash, and that warrants adding in a shill character. And to make it more forgivable, this was in the base roster, unlike another franchise we'll mention in just a little bit. We have now moved on to perhaps the most blatant pick from Sakurai Bias ever, Dark Pit. Now, this inclusion is the most egregious of all for a number of reasons. First off, it was a new clone added during the 4th iteration of Smash. By this point, clones being tacked onto the roster was beyond redundant by this installment. If only we knew what was to come, and yes, more on that later. And this also coincided with Dr. Mario being brought back after being cut from Brawl. When people first seen the ESRB leak that featured Dark Pit and Doc, they all used these inclusions as reasons the leak was fake. Turns out it wasn't fake, and Dark Pit was in fact a Smash 4 newcomer. So point 2 as to why Dark Pit is perhaps the second most hated inclusion of all time is because since he was a key character in Sakurai's previous game, Kid Icarus Uprising, he gets to be included in Smash Brothers. Palutena's got nothing on Dark Pit when it comes to fandom hatred. So, Smash 4 was the first game in the series to introduce post-launch DLC, and with this came 7 inclusions to the roster. 3 of these were veteran fighters who had appeared in a previous title, including the aforementioned Mewtwo, who returned to much fanfare. The other 4 were newcomers. Street Fighter's Ryu and Final Fantasy VII's Cloud were among these picks, who are big-name guest characters who have legacies behind them, and they were seen as great choices from a DLC including perspective. The other 2 newcomers from this DLC cycle, on the other hand, are showered in controversy, and are generally looked down upon by the community. One of these characters I'm going to save for the end, so instead, let's talk about Bayonetta. She had a couple games on the Wii U and was building a bit of a fan base at the time the Smash Ballot shit was going on. Remember the Smash Ballot? The little character request vote you could submit to Nintendo? Well, allegedly, Bayonetta won that vote worldwide. You may wonder why I say allegedly. Well, allow me to explain. Her fans, of course, were thrilled to know this, but many, and myself included, did not buy this one bit. Some odd code related to Bayonetta was found during the time the ballot vote was still ongoing, which really does show they intended to save her for last, and I believe, in my heart of hearts, that the ballot was an experiment to see which characters had the most requests for the next Smash game, which ended up being Ultimate. I think they had Bayonetta planned like the other characters included in the Smash 4 DLC cycle. But since the Wii U was bombing harder than Nintendo could even foresee or imagine, the axe was then put to continuing Smash 4 and anything Wii U related, and the real results were then used to develop newcomers for Ultimate. Ultimate featured Ridley, King K. Rool, and Simon Belmont, who, I'm gonna hazard a guess, all did much better on that ballot than Bayonetta did. But yet, here was Bayonetta, our last Smash 4 DLC newcomer, being hailed as the illustrious ballot winner. Call me a conspiracy theorist, but I'm not the only one who holds this belief. Many others within the fanbase do as well, and it's why Bayonetta is being highlighted in this video, because I don't think her inclusion was a horrible one. In fact, she was still one of the better DLC choices, but being presented as what she was left a sour taste in the mouths of many. Again, myself included. Now let's take a look at Ultimate. It had very little newcomers in the base roster and has had a full season of DLC characters added. Let's start off with the first thing that made people groan. Clones! Echo Fighters. As if slapping a fancier descriptive name was going to make anyone think any more highly of these characters. There were a total of 5 new characters that counted as Echo Fighters in this game. Daisy, a complete clone of Peach. Richter, a complete clone of Simon, who is a newcomer himself, making Richter far more tolerable than the other Echoes. Dark Samus, a complete clone of Samus. Chrom, a semi-clone of Roy. And Ken, who is a semi-clone of Ryu. And you cannot talk about Ken without mentioning Incineroar as well, because Ken Cineroar may be right up there for resulting in the biggest, angry, collective groan we've seen or heard from the community yet. Now, to understand why this was so hated, you had to put yourself back into the time period. We had just come off 3 consecutive long-time requests be brought into the fray. At E3, we had Ridley finally confirmed as a Smash fighter. In the following August Direct, we had Simon confirmed at the beginning, and King K. Rool shown off at the end. Expectations were at an all-time high when going into the final November Direct before the game launched. Who was it going to be, people thought? Which long-time requested character are they going to give us next right before we launch? Could it be Geno? Isaac? Shadow the Hedgehog? Needless to say, it was none of them. Our last full-fledged newcomer to the base roster was another new Pokemon. And not even a popular one at that. I've heard people say over and over that they'd rather it have been Decidueye. But we got the Wrestling Cat. Which for me, as a massive wrestling fan, I love Incineroar personally due to that gimmick alone. But I can't say that saves him from being a key character of this video. He was among one of the most hated reveals of all time, because they built up this base roster so huge by revealing a handful of long-time requested characters beforehand, and then they end the base roster with just another Pokemon, and not even the one that was popular from Sun and Moon, to boot. Oh yeah, and Ken, another Echo Fighter, was revealed too. A semi-clone of Ryu, to his credit, is perhaps the most unique of all the Echo Fighters that were added, but still, to have one of the last reveals be an Echo Fighter was disappointing to almost everyone in the community. Ultimate followed in Smash 4's footsteps and has gone through a full year-plus cycle of DLC, and is about to dive into its second. Appropriate being that it's become the most successful fighting game of all time, but the DLC before the first pass, and then the DLC to end said pass, you could say are among the most hated inclusions in Smash history. May we start off with the only additional fighter outside of the 2 fighters' passes, that being Piranha Plant. Not only was it an out-of-nowhere pick, not only is the plant just a generic enemy, and not only was this generic enemy chosen over someone much more popular and requested, like Waluigi, but this character was technically the first offering of DLC. Granted, most of us got the game and registered early enough to get it as a free bonus. But still, the plant stands as the first official DLC character for Ultimate. Quite a step down from Mewtwo the game before, where everyone and their mother wanted him to come back. Nobody ever wanted Piranha Plant. In fact, I'm sure nobody ever even registered there was potential there for a playable fighter. It would be the equivalent of a Goomba being added. Just completely unfathomable, to the point where Smash fans never could have even conceived of the possibility in the first place. But wait, there's more. So after the plant, we got our first Fighter's Pass. It kicked off pretty hot with an out-of-nowhere inclusion of Joker, who again I don't remember many requests for, but it's kind of like the Cloud situation, where since his game was made famous on PlayStation, no one thought he was possible to begin with. So when he was revealed first, it raised a lot of eyebrows. Then we had Hero, who many might not have cared for in the West, but Dragon Quest is a huge deal in Japan, and we know that's why it was included in Smash Bros. And Banjo and Kazooie to me stands as one of the greatest reveals of all time. Right up there, if not even more amazing than Mega Man and Sonic before them. And then there's Terry, whose inclusion was again one that I loved, having grown up with Fatal Fury, but I will concede and say the fanbase had rather mixed feelings about Mr. Bogart's inclusion. But then came Fighter number 5 of the first pass, and made everyone else who was revealed before them look godlike. So, after a Fighter's Pass that included 4 straight third-party guest characters, you would think Nintendo would have one last big reveal left for us, right? Wrong! Nintendo saved perhaps the absolute worst for last by revealing Byleth, the protagonist of their most recent Fire Emblem game, Three Houses. They were the final character of the first Fighter's Pass. Now, to say this was like a fart in church would be an understatement. Again, many people were expecting one last big third-party guest to end this thing on a high note, as the other characters had set a pretty damn big bar. So some hopes and dreams were crushed here, but I think an even bigger reason why Byleth's inclusion was so panned was because of blatant dishonesty. At the announcement of the first Fighter's Pass, Sakurai mentioned that Rex, from Xenoblade Chronicles 2, was too new of a character to be included as DLC. So instead, they made a Mii costume for Rex, and those who bought the first pass would get said costume. Rex's game was from 2017, may I remind you, and at the time of this announcement, Three Houses wasn't even close to being out yet. In fact, Three Houses only came out in July of last year. So 6 months after it releases, they include Byleth as a shill pick for Fire Emblem to try and drive interest in the series. So Rex couldn't be added because he was too new. But yet, his game came out over a year before this DLC even got started. Yet Byleth, who wasn't even in existence yet, was planned from the beginning? It's simple, folks. Once again, Nintendo is trying to use Smash Bros. To shill Fire Emblem. Xenoblade fans, be damned! Which brings us to who I believe is the most hated character in Smash history, and the character who set the precedent for Fire Emblem using Smash as a shill vehicle, Corrin. That's right, ladies and gents. Corrin was Byleth before Byleth was even a twinkle in Nintendo's eye. Fire Emblem Fates had just released in Japan, and wasn't out in the West yet, so they decided to add Corrin in the months before it launched west side of the world, to draw interest in Fates. I know what some of you might be thinking right now, but Braster. Of course Nintendo is going to use one of its more popular series to hype up another, and I get it, they're a business, and that's fair. But Marth, Roy, Ike, Lucina, and Robin existed at the time of this inclusion, and they seem to be representing the series just fine. Oh, but that's not Fates. I understand that. But I don't think you need to be over-representing a series that doesn't have the numbers to deserve it. Sure, series like Mario and Pokemon have maybe too many fighters as well, but they're both global juggernauts. I can't say the same thing about Fire Emblem. While massive series like Zelda don't even have enough representation, despite their popularity, because Nintendo knows it will and always sell. And it ends up getting the short end of the stick, while Fire Emblem continues to use Smash as an advertisement vehicle so hard. That, and the abundance of sword fighters in this series, does not help. This applies to Byleth and Ultimate as well. For the most part, discounting Robin, every time a new Fire Emblem character is added, they're always fighting with a sword and have a kit that highlights that. And there are far too many of them in this series. So every time another one of the sword fighters are included, the community sighs, groans, and collectively screams into their pillows. Byleth and Ultimate, and Corrin in Smash 4 were just another 2 colored-haired sword users added to the roster to try and sell more Fire Emblem. But since Corrin was the first to set the precedent, I believe them to be the most hated inclusion of all time. So who do you guys think are the most despised or hated characters to ever be included in Smash Bros? Do you agree with most of the characters I highlighted? Or did I leave any out that you want me to be reminded of? Please post on what's on your minds below. And now we begin the cheapest of plugs. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed that time of the video again. As you can see by this lovely little graphic in front of you, there is a list of all of my social media and gaming presences. So please add me, follow me, etc. on those platforms to stay as up-to-date as you can with all of my content going forward. And for those of you who are new to the channel and enjoyed what you've seen and heard, please click on that lovely little subscribe button, and thank you all so very much for watching.